all of this stuff is. So, first one I want to start with is 605 BC. And then we'll go all the way down to about 420 BC. 605 is when the Babylonian Empire comes into real prominence, when Nebuchadnezzar defeats the Egyptians at a battle. Anyway, so the Babylonian Empire comes in, and they, at this particular time, is the first encounter with the Jews, and so they take the first deportation of Jewish citizens back to Babylon. So that's the first deportation. Some scholars would say that Daniel is taken at this time. It's a possibility. The next date is 597. That's the second deportation of Jews to Babylon. And so other scholars will say this is the time when Daniel's taken. And Daniel ends up going to Babylon. And then the next significant date is 586. And anybody remember what happens that year?
That's when Judah gets taken.
Yes, that's the third deportation, but there's one major event that occurs in 586.
It's pretty major.
That's when the temple comes down.
Okay.
That's when the temple's destroyed, and the city is just razed. And remember, at this time, the city is nowhere near the size it has been over the last umpteen years. It really was small. It was sitting on the top of the hill. So 586, the temple goes down. Then the next date is 538 or 37. And that's when the Cyrus issues his decree, which is how Ezra opens up. And it's a citation out of Isaiah 45. Cyrus then issues his decree and allows the Jews to come back. So we have the first deportation, second deportation, third and final deportation, and here's the first return in 538. Then the next event is probably around 520. And that's when the temple is rebuilt. And we get to that in Ezra 6. Ezra 6:15 records the date when the temple is finally rebuilt. So they lay the foundation in 538 or 537, and then there's resistance on the part of those who have been left in the land, and so they stop building the temple, and they start back up again around 524 or so, in the ministry of Haggai and Zechariah, who provoked them to start building again, even though the populace is opposed to it. So they start to rebuild the temple, and from that point on, when they start to rebuild, it takes about 4 years to finish building. But it's that whole time frame there where the temple is going to be reconstructed. Then in about 458 is when Ezra comes back. And when Ezra comes back, that's the second return. So we have the first deportation, first return, second deportation, second return. And then the last date that I'll toss up there is 445. And that's when Nehemiah comes back and brings a group of people. And that's the third return. So we have 3 deportations, and we have 3 recorded returns when they come on back. In this time frame right here are the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra. Ezra 1 to 6 records what goes on from 538 to 520 when the temple's finally rebuilt. And then 458 is Ezra 1 through 7. I mean, Ezra 7 through 10. I think it's 10. Okay, Ezra 7 through 10 is right there, and it's only about a 1 year time frame. So we have all those years in here, and then 1 year right here, and then there's what here, what, about 80 years from the time the temple was finally built until Ezra comes on back. So there's an 80-year time frame in there where the people are in the land, but nothing much is really going on. And they're starting to really stray from whatever belief system they had when they came back. And so then Ezra 7 through 10, Ezra's focus there now is on restoring temple worship and a temple mindset. When you read through the text, I think it shows about, I think I copied down, yeah, in terms of the numbers that came back, there are two different sets of numbers. One is 29,818 when he's counting the family groups, the priests, and the Levites. And then later on he says there's 49,000 some that came back in that return right here. So it's roughly about 50,000 people that come back in that first return under Zerubbabel. Which means that there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews that didn't come back, that stayed there in Persia, in the empire there. They were just settled in, and they apparently, there are historical writings, Herodotus and others, who wrote about the Jews and how successful they became and how wealthy they became. And you see that when they come on back here, and there's all this gold that's given. I forget how many hundreds or thousands of pounds of gold that's given by the Jews who stayed to the Jews who are coming on back to rebuild the temple and all the rest. They also bring back the vessels that had been in the temple, which Nebuchadnezzar and his army had taken when they finally destroyed it, took it back. And the significance on the vessels is that whenever a conqueror conquered a peoples, they would always take their idols and bring their idols to their temple complex and keep their idols there. Well, the Jews didn't have any images. They just had this equipment, these tools or whatever. So they took those, and then when the Jews come back, they give them back the tools and all the rest and bring them on back.
Is it thought that Nebuchadnezzar took the ark?
Oh, not really. There are some who say the ark is hidden underneath the city in some of the subterranean caverns or whatever, but it just disappears. So there's no mention of it, other than the only place we see it is where in the Ark of Triumph in Rome. It depicts the ark being carried there in that frieze where they have all the carvings on the side of that thing. But I forget if that was just in part of the
Well, that probably traveled with Mary.
Right. You're right. Okay. All right, let's see. It's interesting. Do you remember how many families of priests that David had set up? Remember, David organized temple worship. He collected all the material to build it, then organized the temple worship. Do you remember how many families there were that were involved in the worship process? There were 24. And when they come back in the return, there are only 4 families listed. So 20 of those families didn't come back. Only 4 families came on back. And of the scores of priests they had, there were 4,000 priests who came back, and 1,300 and some odd Levites. So that's all the totals there. So those all that stayed in.
That's the final total?
Yeah.
So whatever, they like Babylon?
They just like Babylon, just stayed. Yep. Now, in this time frame here, between here and here, that's when the book of Esther occurs. The book of Esther is the story about the Jews who stayed and didn't come back. So they were the ones who weren't, faithful to the covenant. They had no business staying, so they stayed there. But all of a sudden we have the story of Esther, but it's covering those Jews that had remained in the land. So it's a simple outline for Ezra. Chapters 1 to 6 is a return under Zerubbabel.
Could you spell that?
Zerubbabel. The name means something like born in Babylon or something, or from Babylon. And then chapters 7 to 10 is the return under Ezra. The outlining is not difficult at all. No one knows who wrote it, although their arguments are made that it's probably Ezra because there's a lot of first person in the book. It could have been his own memoirs. Same thing with Nehemiah, a lot of first person stuff in Nehemiah, but it just doesn't, come right out and say that Nehemiah was the author of either one. The Jewish tradition says that Ezra is the author of both, or forgive me, he's the compiler of both, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then the Chronicles. So that he did this when they came back. But there's no other evidence for that. Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the story of Ezra is the focus on the post-exilic community, the community after the exile. Zerubbabel has two other names in the book. One of his names is Sheshbazzar, which is his Babylonian name. And then he's called the Tirshatha in chapter 2. And Tirshatha is the Persian title for governor. So when it calls him up the Tirshatha, he's just the governor. That's his Persian title. Yeah, Zerubbabel is descended from Babylon. So he was probably born during the exile. Well, the purpose of both Ezra and Nehemiah, is to refocus the people of God in terms of their covenant relationship. So now that they're no longer a political entity, they no longer are a kingdom with their own king, the writers are trying to get them to refocus on their relationship with God and the covenant they have with Him.
He's really like a second Moses.
Right? Yeah. Ezra's like
starting over.
Yeah, starting over again. Yeah. And there are some, you'll read some guys who draw parallels between what went on during that period of time because of that. Ezra's name is a shortened form of Azariah. If you remember sometime back when Brian was teaching on Genesis 2 and he talked about the Ezer, the helper. So it's a shortened form of the same word. So Azariah means Jehovah's my helper. Jehovah's one who helps me. Look at all the kings. Okay, Zerubbabel comes out of David's line. He's out of Judah. Ezra came out of the line of Levi. He's out of Aaron's line. Ezra was a scribe, and from him comes this whole line of scribes. And so by the time of the Lord Jesus and the ministry of the gospel, the scribes are a real dominant group. Oh. Between chapter 6 and 7 is a period of 58 years. And that's when the story of Esther occurs, during that time frame there. Okay, chapter 3 of Ezra, we begin the temple construction in 3:8. And there's one little anomaly. Chapter 3, verse 8. He appointed the Levites who were 20 years old or more to supervise the work on the Lord's house. Do you remember when we were in the book of Numbers, how old you had to be to work in the Lord's house? You couldn't serve as a priest until you reached the age of 30. But there was an age at which you could carry ash and trash in the temple. You could do all the grunt work. That was 25. So all of a sudden now we see that begin to change here. Now they're lowering the age from 25 to 20. Okay, opposition starts in chapter 4 of Ezra. And they halt to work on the temple. Chapter 4, verse 8 through chapter 6, verse 18 is in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. And if you remember, when they're in the captivity, one of the frustrations is that they even forget their own language. And then they pick up Aramaic or Farsi, whatever the language is at that period of time. So that when we get to Nehemiah, and Nehemiah talks about Ezra teaching, it says, and so Ezra read the book of the law distinctly and gave the sense. He had to translate from Hebrew, that he was reading in Hebrew, into Aramaic so that the people could understand it, because they had forgotten their own language. So it's...
That's just one generation.
One generation.
Yeah, right, yeah. So just the kids growing up there, I mean, they're just... And remember, during this period of time, Jeremiah writes him a letter, and in the letter Jeremiah tells them how to behave when they're there. Jeremiah 29, it's a letter to the people in exile. He says, now, live there, build houses, put gardens in, don't give your kids here, don't give your daughters to them, and don't take their sons or whatever, but become part of the land. And so they really did do, they really had to pick their own language. Yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, you think about immigrants here, how many first generation kids can't understand their parents' language?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it happened though. Why it happened so quick, I don't know.
Right.
It was part of the policy apparently. Oh, and so then chapter 4, they begin to rebuild. The building resumes rather, 424, and that's as a result of the ministry of Haggai and Zechariah. They provoked the people to get back to building that temple. And then it's finally completed in chapter 6, verse 15. It mentions when it was completed. Okay. 7 to 10, then the focus is on Ezra, on his return, and then what he's trying to do to reorient the people toward their fidelity to the covenant. And go to Ezra chapter 9. When Ezra's informed of the mixed marriages that had gone on. Ezra 9. 3. Indeed, they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy people have become mixed with surrounding peoples. The leaders and officials have taken the lead in this unfaithfulness. When I heard this report, I tore my tunic and robe, pulled out some of the hair from my head and beard, and sat down devastated. So this was his reaction. Now go to Nehemiah chapter 13, just to show you a contrast. Years later now, we've got the same problem, and Nehemiah's informed of it. And in verse 23 of chapter 13. In those days I also saw Jews who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or one of the other peoples, but could not speak Hebrew. I rebuked them, cursed them, beat some of their men, and pulled out their hair. Here's the contrast.
You do it on somebody else.
Ezra pulls out his own hair, Nehemiah pulls out somebody else's hair. And that's
As soon as Ezra was a priest, Nehemiah was a soldier.
That's right. So I'll use that. To me, it's just a good illustration of how people can be so different. God using both of them, you know.
How can Ezra be so ignorant of that? The intermarriages and all. I mean,
What had gone on with the people in the land?
Right.
Because he hadn't been there.
but he knew the story of Esther, right?
He may have, yeah.
Well, I mean, everybody knew the Jews were going to be slaughtered throughout the whole land, and everybody knew.
Oh yeah,
That's what I don't get is how he could be.
I mean, even their marriage.
Their queen was a Jew,
Right.
intermarried. I mean,
Yeah.
it just seemed to me to be so prevalent.
Yeah.
When I read his reaction, it's like
I didn't know that.
with the culture.
One of the things it could be that he may well have thought that those who had returned were those who were so oriented toward God compared to everybody who stayed, and so he had a higher expectation for those who had gone back compared to all those who had stayed in the land. And so when he gets back and finds out that even they have gone this bad and married up, he gets upset with it. Yeah, one other contrast between these two guys is, let's see if I can find it. Jotted it down. Yeah, go to Ezra chapter 8. Yeah, Ezra 8, verse 21. I proclaimed a fast by the Ahava River so that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask Him for a safe journey for us, our children, and all our possessions. I did this because I was ashamed to ask the king for infantry and cavalry to protect us from enemies during the journey, since we had told him the hand of our God is gracious to all who seek Him, but His anger is against all who abandon Him. So we fasted and pleaded with our God for this, and He granted our request. So Ezra won't ask for anything. And now go to Nehemiah.
Oh, gosh. Nehemiah's not afraid to ask.
That's right, Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 7.
I think plead is one.
Yeah. You know, the king says, how long will you take, verse 6, how long will your journey take and when will you return? So I gave him a definite time and it pleased the king to send me. I also said to the king, if it pleases the king, let me have letters to the governors, etc. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress, the city wall, and home where I will live. King granted my request. So here we have the contrast again. Ezra won't ask for anything, and Nehemiah's going to ask for whatever he can get. Now, what's interesting is that many evangelicals will take the Ezra position and won't ask for anything, and they're going to quote, just trust God. Can you think of any missionaries that are in that mindset? Any mission movements?
Just trust.
Mm-hmm. Never make the request known.
I think, well, denominationally, Assemblies of God are very trusting.
They're oriented that way, but there have been mission movements. Have you ever heard of the China Inland Missionaries? Or it's now called OMF, Operation Mobilization. But that was Hudson Taylor's big deal, was that Hudson Taylor would never ask for money, never make his request known, and he was just going to trust God for the mission. And so for over 100 years, you would never get a China Inland missionary asking for anything. They would just go and trust God, and they would always anchor passages like this.
It's like the Tibetan monks, they never ask for food, they just trust that it's going to be provided.
Right, yeah.
And how did that work out?
Oh, Hudson Taylor, what ended up, he lived that way for years, for many, many years, but then all of a sudden, as the mission got bigger and bigger, although they would never ask for money, they would send out prayer letters. And the prayer letters, they would just share needs and things like that, and then people would respond via the prayer
I
letters.
sure wish I had some food. We're doing great here.
We're a
Sorry.
little cold.
Lost 40 pounds last month.
Have any of you heard of George Mueller? Are you familiar? Okay. Are you familiar with a denomination called the Plymouth Brethren? PBs. Wherever you see a chapel, like Limerick Chapel, started out PB. It still may be Brethren, but whenever a quote-unquote religious group calls itself a chapel, more than not, they have Plymouth Brethren roots. And the Plymouth Brethren started in Plymouth, England, through an Anglican priest named John Nelson Darby. He had got frustrated with Anglicanism, and so he broke off from that. Although he never left the Anglican Church, he started his own little movement, and they started, quote-unquote, a house church type of thing there in Plymouth, England, and from that, then they called themselves Brethren. Just like the Restoration movement, they just wanted to be called Christians. Well, at this time, they were just going to call one another Brethren, and so the Plymouth Brethren movement started there. And their most noteworthy person, besides John Nelson Darby, is a fellow named George Mueller. And George Mueller was a pastor, and in the context of his pastoring, decided that he would take in kids and started an orphanage. And Mueller would never ask for money, and he would just pray, quote-unquote, pray in what they needed. And this went on for years. He ran 10,000 kids through that orphanage during his lifetime. He died when he was in his 90s. Unbelievable. If you ever get a chance to read his biography, it's called George Mueller of Bristol. And it is really, really interesting. I mean, some of the war stories in there in terms of praying for needs for the people who just, you think, good night. Oh, it's funny. He's quite a character. He was a lot like Wesley. Yeah, Wesley said, when I die, if I have more than 4 pence in my pocket and more than 1 set of clothes, and whatever my possessions are, you'll know that I died a thief and a robber. And Mueller was the same way. When Mueller died, he had 1 set of clothes in his closet, he had his glasses and some change in his pocket, and that was all he had.
But wasn't Wesley also, like 84, said, I'm getting lazy now, I want to sleep past 5:30 in the morning?
Right. I mean, there was a different breed of guys back then. But you ought to read George Mueller of Bristol. But he was one of those who would only pray and money. But it ended up that out of those kids that went through the orphanage, many became statesmen, leading figures economically in England and all the rest. And then the next guy that did it, had an orphanage like that, was Spurgeon. Spurgeon had a huge orphanage, yeah.
So if you're on the Nehemiah side, then
Yes.
are you lacking faith then?
Apparently not.
And do you think that's a conviction or a personality type?
I have a suspicion it's probably more personality as opposed to, but I'm sure it's a conviction too, but I think there are just certain folk who are just more oriented that way. Yeah, they're just uncomfortable asking.
What was Ezra's position in Babylon?
We don't know. I was wondering that today when I was thinking, why was he called before the king? Because apparently the king called him to go back and investigate what's going on. Because I think in chapter 7 and 8, he's given this charge by the king to go back there and find out what's going on. Mm-hmm. And then, and that's what ends up prompting him there. But there's nothing else in the text that's how God moved, other than it may say that God put it in the mind of the king. Let's see.
Because I just thought that maybe it was position too, because wasn't Nehemiah the cupbearer?
Nehemiah was the cupbearer, yeah.
So they were very close.
Yeah. No. I thought it was the king had put it. Yeah, right. Chapter 7, verse 27. Praise the Lord God of our fathers, who has put it into the king's mind to glorify the Lord, the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, and has shown favor to me before his king, his council, and all his powerful officers. Same thing happens with Nehemiah, where it says that and God put it into mind. God put it into mind. So that's how he moved these folks there. But anyway, that's the contrast between those two guys. So I always think, well, that's people are going to be in one of those two camps, in somewhere between. Okay, so I mentioned Ezra 9, Nehemiah 9, and Daniel 9 are prayer chapters in the scriptures. So if you ever want to read heavy prayers and just get a feel for what goes on in prayer, read Ezra 9, Nehemiah 9, and Daniel 9. Circumstantially, it just worked out that way, but and you'll see that in all three prayers, the one who's praying is identifying with the people. So it isn't just the people that's bad. It's I'm bad, we're all bad, that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. Oh, look at Nehemiah. Yeah, his name means comfort of Jehovah or comfort of Yahweh. And again, the purpose is to remind the people of the fidelity to the covenant in God, and also to help them understand that God had a hand providentially in what was going on in their experience. God had promised them that he would have them in captivity for only 70 years. And the 70 years run from about here down to here. Is that about 70 years? 538 to 605, it's about 70 years there. Okay. So then the focus in Ezra is rebuilding the temple and restoring the worship. Focus in Nehemiah is going to be on rebuilding that wall to get the city secure again. So now here, by the time Nehemiah gets there in 445, they've been almost 100 years back there and still haven't got that wall built up yet. So they got the temple up, but they don't have the wall up. So he goes back then, and you remember how many days it took to rebuild the wall? Oh, no, 52 days, very good, yep. 52 days. Okay. The outline I've got for Nehemiah, chapter 1 through 7 is construction. Chapter 8 through 10 is consecration. And chapters 11 through 13 are consolidation. So focus on getting that wall up and getting the people squared away and then consolidating them politically. Okay, now Malachi is probably ministering during this time frame here. So Malachi, remember, the last book of the Old Testament. He's ministering during that time frame when Nehemiah is going back and forth to Jerusalem. The focus of Malachi is chastising the nation for their infidelity. Ezra and Nehemiah had tried to provoke the people to covenant faithfulness, to fidelity to the covenant. And then time passes and they just go right back to their old ways again. And then we end up going for 400 years where there's no more information from God. Okay. Nothing else really that I wanted to bring out at this point on Nehemiah. I'm sure you've all heard plenty of messages on rebuilding the wall.
You made the comment about the distance of time from the temple to the wall. But, I mean, the wall's really a completely different issue for the rest of it. I mean, the wall's like building a nuclear weapon.
Right.
As opposed to just building a
That's right.
church.
Yep. Yeah, and that was the argument that the opponents used, that if they put that wall up, then you're going to lose taxes, you're not going to have these people going to be rebellious or whatever. And it's interesting, you see the hand of providence in terms of the decree having been issued and then forgotten about, and then having to go search for those records to find it, and it's there. It just took them a while to find it. And one of the things I noted that there were 3 different capital cities that the king would move from. He'd move from Babylon to Susa to another one. And so there were records in various places. And so when the searching is going for the records, they've got to go to these various locations to find these records. But then they ended up finding it to get the thing built again. So again, you just see the providence of God. Providence of God. Providence of God. And then again, too, just the recognition that man, from the beginning, has been an unbelievable record keeper. Whether we're writing on stones or we're writing on papyrus or whatever, we keep records. Yeah. Oh, man.
Not for nothing. This is 2 days we read the wall,
Uh-huh.
and how amazed it was. I mean, I didn't see what kind of wall, like what kind of dimensions were we talking?
Well, it doesn't give us any dimension, other than we know that, remember, they said, they ridiculed them in terms of building that wall, and they said something to the effect that foxes won't even be able to run on it. If you got a fox up on it, it would come down. So after they get the wall built up, Nehemiah gathers the people, breaks them into 2 groups, has one group start on this side of the wall and walk up to here, on the wall, and the other group start on this side and walk up here to the end, and they meet, and then they have a worship service, just to demonstrate that the thing was a substantial wall, so they could walk on top of it. But it doesn't tell us how thick it was or whatever, other than we do have records of how the walls around Babylon were so huge. I mean, they were huge, for crying out loud. I was watching a thing on Discovery this last night, I think, on the Citadel at Hawaii, and they said the wall there around the Citadel was 100 feet thick. 100 feet thick, for crying out loud. And I know that on the wall around Babylon, they could ride 3 chariots abreast on the wall, going around the city. So it was just that huge. Yeah, so just fantastic. It was, they were just a magnificent building for them, and all that manual labor, keep those captives busy. Okay, yeah. Now, actually, and then we get to Esther. Let's just do Esther. The thing that's significant about Esther, one of the things that's significant about Esther, is the king, Ahasuerus. That was his Persian name. His Greek name is Xerxes. And he's the one who planned the campaign against Greece, where he had a 1 million-man army. Took him 4 years to plan and gather all of his logistics so as to launch the campaign. And the banquet that Esther records is the quote-unquote banquet in planning time when he had all of his leadership come in prior to the campaign. And we learn this from Herodotus. Herodotus, the Greek historian, makes a record of what had gone on that time and mentions this particular feast, where he has all of his leadership in prior to, going in the campaign. And then if you remember that campaign, that's where the troops were stopped at Thermopylae. Remember that? And then also the Spartans, stopped at Thermopylae. And then also Xerxes had this huge fleet of ships. And so he launches the fleet of ships against the Greeks, and it's this huge naval battle at Salamis. And he's defeated there too. So the Greeks both beat him on the ground and then beat him at sea. And this was this guy, Ahasuerus. And it was so funny. When I was reading this today, I thought, from what Herodotus tells us about him, what we see in the text and other historians, the first thing about the Bible was, he's a John McCain. He had this mercurial temper. He would freak out and blow up at the drop of a hat. And I thought, that's John McCain. Oh dear. Anyway, so this is Esther. Why do you think, based on your reading of this, why do you think it would have had a problem getting into the canon? Okay, God isn't mentioned at all.
Focus. What to focus on a woman.
Okay. Okay. We had another book. We had Ruth. Remember, was focused on it's the only other book that just kind of went from one.
Well, like you said, it's sort of, she's disobedient in two senses. She's not in Jerusalem.
Right.
She's married to a foreigner.
Right. Yeah. Sex with a foreigner, married to a foreigner. There's absolutely no reference in the book to Jerusalem. And the significance of Jerusalem is it's the city of the great king, Psalm 48. It is where their king is. God is their king, and that's his city. But there's no mention of it at all. There's no mention of the law. No mention of Moses. They're significant people. So it had difficulty getting in the canon for a long time. And one other point, I just learned this today, I wasn't aware of this, that it's the one book that was not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the reason for that is that the one feast that the Essene community would never observe was Purim. So that probably answers why they never had the book there. Because wasn't a feast that God had set up in their mind, it was a feast that the people had set up. And so the Essenes were such purists, like the Puritans or the Separatists, but they just were not going to have that. Just I remember the Puritans didn't celebrate Christmas. So when they came over here, the Separatists and Puritans were just anti-Christmas like gangbusters.
Of course, I mean, in one sense, though, the effects of the pogrom against the Jews would have been nationwide and would have involved.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
So in that sense, it was going to kill Jews.
Right. It was part of Jerusalem was one of I don't know the name of the province, but it was one of the provinces. Remember, it says they had 120 or 127 provinces. So Jerusalem was one of them. The interesting thing is that at this time frame, 538, 537, Cyrus has risen to prominence in an alliance with the Medes. They defeat the Babylonians. And we'll get this when we do Daniel, but in Daniel chapter 5, remember there's a feast and there's the handwriting on the wall. Mm-hmm. And there's a guy named Belteshazzar who is the viceroy, and he says to Daniel, and you'll be third in the kingdom. And the reason for that was that the king was in another one of his capital cities. His second in command was Belteshazzar, And the third one who then would be Daniel, if he was able to interpret the dream. Well, that very night was the night that Cyrus conquers the city. Because remember, the city was on the Euphrates River. And the only way into that city was through the river. But they had this huge gate that they ran down into the water so that you couldn't, get in. So what does Cyrus do? Cyrus, miles upriver, digs a huge channel to bypass Babylon so that the river will go through this bypass and allow them to go into the gates into the city. That's how they got in the city that night. And Herodotus tells us that they went to this huge building campaign to bypass the city, to get the river to bypass the city so they could go under the gate and get in the city. And that's what happened that night. Because remember, it tells us that night it fell. Just amazing. And again, God leaves us a record of what had gone on, so we have an idea what went on. It's awesome. Unbelievable. So my outline for Esther is a real easy one again. Chapter 1 to 4 is threat. Chapter 5 to 10 is triumph. Or I did another real simple one. Chapters 1 to 3, plot formed. Chapters 4 to 5, plot fought. Chapters 6 to 10, plot foiled. And again, Esther, just in terms of the purpose, its purpose is just to, again, show us the providence of God in the lives of His people, even in the sense of people who weren't faithful to Him in terms of going back. He's still involved in the nation. So that little story, whatever, if nothing else, at least serves to let the people know that God's hand is still on these people at this particular point in time, in terms of His faithfulness to Him and His promise to them.
I read somewhere too that Haman's race or something was somehow related to Alexander.
Oh,
No. He's
okay. But was he from, wasn't he one of the descendants of the Amalekites who were supposed to be wiped out?
Right.
So if they had obeyed him back
That's
then,
right.
this wouldn't have happened.
Exactly right.
I'm sure if that was
Yeah.
true.
No, he was an Amalekite. Agagite.
Somehow they said, I read a whole webpage on this, that somehow there was some relation between him and Alexander.
Really?
Sort of a foreshadowing of what was going to happen.
Is that right? I hadn't heard that. Good night, because Alexander was a Greek for crying out loud. He'd be Persian. Yeah, not man. But anyway, he's hoisted on his own petard. You know what that is, don't you?
No, I didn't hear you said actually.
Oh.
I was distracted.
You know what the petard was? Someone hoisted on their own petard?
That's all right.
So out of the book of Esther, then we get the Feast of Purim. And remember what the word Purim meant? What's the text study about Purim?
Isn't it the day?
Lots.
Because of the lot.
Casting lots, yeah. Casting lots. And I thought I'd quote you a stanza out of a poem, one of my favorites. Yeah. And one of the stanzas says, careless seems the great avenger, history's pages but record one death grapple in the darkness twixt old systems of the word. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. And that's what he was doing with Israel, keeping watch over them. James Russell Lowell, Unitarian who's been influenced by the scriptures. All right, that was a quick blow through them for this time.
How long does Persia last? after this? When does Persia fall?
Oh, Persia doesn't fall till Alexander,
Which is when?
323. Yeah. Yeah, well, from 333 to 323 is the big years of Alexander's life, so it lasts a couple hundred years. Yeah. And they had mounted significant campaigns. The other thing was, the question is, why does Cyrus let them go back? What is because all the conquerors up to this point had always moved populations from one area to another so as to quell any potential for rebellion. And now during this particular period of time, there is conflict all over the Middle East in terms of the various empires fighting with one another. And Cyrus comes up with the idea that I'll send these people back to their original homelands, and that will make them more happy with me and grateful, and I won't have to worry about fighting in that area. And so they're just going to
Sort of how the Romans
Yeah,
did.
right.
Did.
Yeah, yeah. So it's just interesting to see how those things just start to play out, but the other thing is looking at how long God takes to do things. He takes hundreds and hundreds of years, and we want it done right now. It's just like, I use the illustration with Rick Warren. As soon as we get that last person saved, he's just going to come back.
Yeah.
And so we'll just hurry it up right now. Ain't going to happen. In fact, remember when God made the promise to Abraham, he said to Abraham, thousands and thousands of generations. That's a long time. You better insist. I mean, if a generation's either 20 years, 40 years, or 100 years, it's a long, 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 long time. That's what I always say, history's going to go on for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So just relax. Enjoy it. Oh. So then that's the end of the historical books. We are done with the historical books.
Poetics.
Now we're going to do the poetics. Job. Job will be the next one. And I'll get a PowerPoint together so I can send that to you so you get these notes. I came across this, and they're always trying to find something in the book of Esther that indicates God had a hand in it. So they figured out that there are 4 places in the book of Esther where you know what the tetragrammaton is? Have you ever heard that phrase?
Yeah. I came up last group.
Tetragrammaton. It's the 4 letters.
Oh, yeah.
Jehovah. YHVH. This is, that little mark there is called a yod. Remember Jesus said, the jot and the tittle. Not one jot or tittle will fall from the law till it's all fulfilled. Okay, this is the jot. In the Hebrew, D is written like that, and this is the tittle. So Jesus says, this little stroke and this little stroke are going to continue until the whole thing is fulfilled. But this is the tetragrammaton. And so there are 4 places in Esther where they find YHVH. 2 places where it's written this way, and then 2 places where it's written backwards. YHVH. Going this way. And every time I come across this, I think of those, there's a group of Jews that are involved in finding the hidden numbers in the Bible, and they've got all these programs, and they're running these programs to come up with all these predictions and prophecies and all the rest. And I thought that, right. Anyway, so they found this in the book of Esther.
I was thinking, the stock market dropped 777. Nobody said anything.
Was it that much?
Well, a couple weeks ago.
Oh.
The day after the bill didn't go through.
Oh yeah, okay.
The bailout bill.
666 and 777?
Well, it's coming. We're gonna hit 7,700.
Yeah.
So-
777?
I got a text today, whatever it dropped today, some guy said, well, the good news is it can only do this 12 more times.
Oh, dear. Dear, dear, dear. We are getting so screwed up. Thank God for the knowledge of his sovereignty. You know, he's involved in all of it. He has a purpose in it. And one of those purposes might be to just mess us up royally.
Yes.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Well, look
Yeah.
at what his corrections look like, for goodness sake.
yeah.
In the Old Testament.
You bet, you bet.
Yeah.
It's interesting, I listened to a lecture, or an interview today by Robert Pape, who teaches at, it's Columbia. And I had always heard that the terrorist bombings, the suicide bombings, are always religiously motivated.
And not hurt. Oh.
Yeah, well, almost always.
Oh.
But like, why else would you do it?
Yeah. And it's interesting to note that there hasn't been one Shia suicide terrorist. They're all Sunnis.
They're all Sunni?
They're all Sunnis.
Interesting.
In the largest terrorist group engaged in suicide bombings are the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. Not
Oh,
Islam.
yes, no, yes.
It's the Tamil Tigers who started it, and they're the largest group that have done it. And this blew my mind. From 2000